In today's video, we're going to take a quick look at the Ampla client interface. So this is the interface that allows users to enter data as well as do some data analysis tasks. So the layout of the client is reasonably straightforward. So this is the one single client that we use for data entry purposes as well as data analysis. So you're going to find plant room operators will be using this client, as well as supervisors and even the mechanical and process engineer types. The client is set up as a modular based system, so if you want to look at downtime data, you'll be selecting the downtime module, production data, metrics data, and so on. So if I start in the top left hand corner, you can see that we have fairly familiar layout of controls up here. We have a back button and a forward button, so if I was to navigate around in the client, you'll see that they will become active once I do some looking around in here. And then we have the concept of a home location. So again, when we set up user accounts, they will be set up with a default home, but you can set your own home so that if you were a plant control room operator, you'll have a space that will return you when you hit home. Typically that's delay records for your current shift or something similar. Refresh button there, and then we go into the filter button, which opens our filter builder. So I'll just select that and you can see. So I'm currently in the downtime module, so therefore it's opened the filter builder with all of the different fields that are relevant have opened. So I'll close that filter builder, and then we move on, and then we have the ability here to add a record. So depending on where I'm located in my equipment hierarchy, you'll see that add record button has now become available, and that's because I've selected a specific hierarchy location where I have a reporting point that allows me to add a record. So that there would typically be grayed out or lightened when we don't have the ability to add a record, and only becomes active when we have selected a correct location where we can do so. We then have the data grid, so you'll see there that I can turn that top data grid on and off, and I'll just chuck a chart down the bottom so we can see the difference there. So this is the data grid up here, this is the charting panel, so I can turn that grid on and off, which leaves the charting panel to take up the entire space, so I can turn that on and off. And then I can also turn the charting panel on and off. So you would see in this instance here I have quite a lot of delay records being shown, so therefore we would typically turn the charting panel off if we were setting the client up for say a control room operator who is not really going to be analyzing data, they're just looking at the grid and filling out records. And then beyond that we have the reports button. So we would typically nest reports inside of the client via this link up here. So currently we have a couple of default reports, so I don't really have anything in there at this stage. So if we go a little bit further across here, over to the right, you can see here, this is where we have the ability to manage our favorites. So when we set users up inside of Ampla, there's obviously many different types of data they can look at. Often users would like to retain views of their data, so we would allow them to save favorites, and that can be as simple as saying I just want to see delay records for my current shift or last shift or something like that, or even a more specific view of data where we've grouped data together for longer periods so that users can save favorites. Now, depending on the setup of the individual user, they may actually have the ability to save what we call shared favorites. So if you've got the correct permissions, you'll be able to save favorites that can be then allocated to other roles or other groups of users inside of the system, which is useful. And then we can also see here that we've got the ability to set users shared favorites. So that's where we can then go and allocate specific favorites to different users and groups there. And then this is where we can set that home. So if I have a view of data that I like, so if I go and set something up here, I'll just set my pie chart and group that by, say, classification. And if I like that view, I can then say, now I want to set that as my home. I'll say yes. So now when I come back into the client, it'll always give me this view of data because I've set that as my home view. Okay, so we'll move on now. So now we also have some settings in here. So we have the ability to print a view of data, and we can also reset the layout of the client windows back to a default setting. Moving on, we've now got help and about, so we can actually open the Ampla client help from this particular link here. We can access the help, which tells us information about the version of Ampla that we're using and some details. So this is useful when you're possibly talking to, say, a support person, whether it's inside of your business or possibly an Aviva support person, where you can quote to them the version of the application you're using. And now we have this reasonably new option here, which is actually showing me if I have any sort of notifications or alerts that are active that are specific to my user inside of the client. So this is where we now have the ability to notify an Ampla client user that something has happened that they need to pay attention to. That might be, new delay records they need to complete, or records they haven't completed, or even issues with the underlying data feeding through the system. So this little icon here will light up. We can look at that in a different video. And then, as mentioned before, then we have the name of the user logged on, so administrator. So typically this would be a specific username via Ampla's ability to detect that user via Active Directory and who they've logged on to their machine as. So that's that top bar. Now if we look at the layout inside of the client, over here on the left we have what is considered to be our equipment hierarchy. So again, if you're using the system, you're going to see a layout that has been allocated to you. So we can change this with security, but typically for a regular user, they will see a site or some assets that are relevant to them and not assets that are effectively hidden or not relevant to their role. So in this instance, I've got a demo project with my fictitious Aviva Coal enterprise, and you can see that I have a number of sites within that. Now in this instance, I've got access to Mine North, Mine South, and even Central Control. So we would typically set users up so that if they worked at Mine North, we would essentially isolate them so they wouldn't see Mine South or Central Control. They would just see their relevant site and so on. Now this view of the hierarchy up here is really just to allow people to navigate through the data. So you can imagine if I'm capturing delay records down at the crushing location, plant location, and also say a train loadout, and I only really wanted to focus on crushing, I would select crushing. Therefore the data is being filtered here over in the grid to only show crushing type records, whereas if I selected Mine North, I would have all of the records being captured at any location under Mine North, assuming that I've got this this folder button turned on here, which essentially shows all data from child locations and that location in the grid at the same time. So the tip here would be to keep this button on at all times. Okay, now if we go down a little bit lower in the window here, you can see that we have our module selector as mentioned before. So this is where we're selecting whichever module the data is living inside of Ampla. So you'll only see modules here that are active within your configuration. So if we did not have inventory configured or metrics configured, you would not have a button down here showing that. So I have a number of those modules configured. That's why they are visible down here. And this little drop down here is quite important, but this is a view drop down, and I'd encourage you to read a little bit more about that in help if need be. But this is where if we had, say, multiple reporting points configured at a particular location, this view will actually show us those individual reporting points, and we can separate them out. Now this view button, typically you want to leave that in its default standard view, but if you're using something like inventory, it's a much more say complex control where we have the ability to look at views of data that are sitting over the top of our inventory, so we can actually return some complex views where we're saying just give me the balance of all of my material over time or by lot or lot group. So it's much more relevant, this setting, when you're looking at, say, inventory than probably some of the other modules. So if I go back to downtime now, and as I mentioned before, we've got the data grid up the top, and again you can see that in the data grid, and there's a whole lot of options in here which I can cover in a different video, but this is where we can see lots of columns of data, all the relevant columns of data that we have configured. We have the ability to turn some of those columns on and off, so you can see here that I can just go and turn them off and turn selected columns on, so that gives us control over that. We can also do some grouping up here where we can drag columns around and do some grouping of data, so I'll get rid of that. Just turn all these back on. So lots of functionality up here. We also have a row of data at the bottom that effectively brings back summary, so that'll allow us to bring totals as well as average values. If I was to enable that, we would possibly need to have an average of all values in a particular column, so it can do that. So that's the data grid. And then down the bottom here we have the charting panel. So this again is where, if we want to do some sort of straightforward data analysis, we may turn on the charting panel, and you can see here that some of the options in this charting panel are relevant to the module that you've selected. So in downtime, as an example, we have pie charts, we have Pareto charts and Gantt charts available to us. But when we select something like metrics and we come back into the charting panel, you'll see that we actually have quite a few different options that are more statistical based. So that there is a very quick overview of the Ampla 2018 client. I hope that was helpful for you. Thanks for watching. Bye.